What if the moment that stopped a 50% tariff wall in its tracks came down to 3 words a prime minister refused to stop repeating? 90 minutes before a $20 billion tariff deadline hit, Washington blinked first, and almost nobody has explained why that actually happened. Before we go further, here's a quick ask. If you like breakdowns that actually explain the economics behind the headlines instead of just repeating them, subscribe to this channel right now, tap the like button, and if you know someone who keeps asking why Canada and the US are always fighting over trade, send them this video. It genuinely helps this channel grow, and it will only take you a few seconds. Now let's get into what actually happened. It was late on the evening of August the 18th, 2026, and trading desks across North America were watching one clock. In less than 2 hours, a 50% tariff was set to hit roughly $20 billion worth of Canadian exports, everything from milk and plywood to hockey sticks and beer. Auto parts. Suppliers in Ontario and Michigan were bracing for disruption. Dairy processors were recalculating margins, lumberyards were staring down higher costs, and then, just before midnight, President Trump posted on social media that the tariffs were being paused. No dramatic press conference, no lengthy explanation. Just a short post announcing that the 50% duties, set to take effect at 1 minute past midnight, would be delayed for 3 days while both sides finished what he called a deal. Prime Minister Carney's response, released shortly after, was far more measured. He said substantial progress had been made, but that important work still remained. 2 very different tones from 2 leaders describing the exact same 11th hour outcome. If you want to understand how modern trade leverage actually works, this moment is worth studying closely. Because what happened in those final 90 minutes was not random. It was not a lucky phone call or a sudden change of heart. It was the result of one side understanding exactly what it had to lose, and the other side finally admitting it. Could not afford to find out. To understand why this standoff even reached the brink, you have to go back more than a year. Donald Trump returned to the White House with an aggressive trade agenda toward nearly every major partner, but Canada faced some of the sharpest rhetoric of all. Tariffs were threatened, paused, threatened again. 35% here, 50% there, each new number landing like a fresh shock on an already exhausted relationship. Canadian officials spent the better part of 18 months in a strange rhythm, negotiating hard, absorbing new threats, negotiating again. It helps to remember just how unusual this level of tension actually is between these 2 countries. For most of the last century, the border between Canada and the United States was treated almost as a formality when it came to trade. Factories were built assuming parts could cross back and forth without friction. Energy pipelines and power lines were constructed on the assumption that supply would flow uninterrupted for decades. An entire generation of business planning on both sides simply assumed that the relationship, whatever political noise surrounded it, would stay fundamentally stable. Watching that assumption get tested repeatedly throughout 2025 and 2026 was, for many industries on both sides of the border, genuinely unprecedented. Through nearly all of it, one phrase kept surfacing from Carney, in French and in English, in front of provincial premiers, in front of reporters, on calls with Trump himself. Canada will not accept a bad deal. He said it in the summer of 2025 at a meeting of Canada's premiers. He said it again in the months that followed, whenever a new deadline loomed. He was not just talking to Washington. He was talking to Canadians, to markets, and to every trade partner watching how a smaller economy might handle pressure from a much larger one. That phrase carried weight because of who was saying it. Carney had spent years running 2 of the most important central banks in the world, first the Bank of Canada, then the Bank of England, where he helped steer the United Kingdom through the turbulence of its exit from the European Union. This was not a politician improvising trade strategy on the fly. This was someone who had spent a career reading exactly how markets react to confidence versus desperation, and he brought that instinct directly into the negotiating room. And here's the thing about that instinct. Markets do not just watch what a country says, they watch what a country's currency does. Through the worst stretches of this trade standoff, the Canadian dollar held relatively steady. It did not collapse the way currencies often do when a government appears cornered or desperate. That stability was itself a message. It told global investors that behind Carney's calm public statements sat something concrete, real assets, real leverage, and real patience. Now let's talk about what was actually on the table, because this is where the standoff becomes less about political theater and more about hard economic math. The tariffs, threatened under a section of a nearly century-old trade law targeted around 500 product categories, hitting Canada's automotive, alcohol, and dairy sectors especially hard. On paper, that sounds sweeping. But look closer at what was deliberately left off that list. Energy, potash, uranium, several critical minerals, all of it exempted before the tariffs were ever formally announced. That exclusion list tells you everything about where the real leverage actually sat. You do not carve out an entire sector from a punishing tariff package unless taxing it would hurt your own economy more than the other side's. Canadian oil feeds American refineries across the Midwest every single day. Canadian potash fuels American farmland every planting season. Canadian uranium powers a meaningful share of the reactors that keep American electricity grids running. None of that is easily replaced in a matter of weeks, let alone days. Washington's own tariff list, by what it chose to leave out, quietly admitted just how much of this relationship it could not afford to disrupt. If this kind of grounded, fact-based breakdown is something you actually want more of, do me a favor right now. Drop a comment telling me one word for how you describe this entire standoff. I read every single one, and it genuinely helps me understand what to dig into next. It's also worth remembering that a deadline like this one rarely announces itself as a single, isolated event. It is the visible tip of months of quiet positioning, private phone calls, draft language passed back and forth between officials, and countless smaller decisions that never make it into a headline at all. The 90 minutes before midnight, on August the 18th, were dramatic precisely because everything that led up to them had been so slow and deliberate. That contrast, months of patience followed by a sudden visible resolution, is exactly the kind of moment that tends to get flattened into a simple story about one dramatic night, when the real explanation stretches back over a year of careful, largely unseen groundwork. Let's talk about the sheer scale of what was actually at risk here, because the number that matters most is not 20 billion, it's closer to 900 billion. That is roughly the total annual value of trade flowing between Canada and the United States, built on decades of deeply integrated supply chains. Car parts cross that border multiple times during a single vehicle's assembly. Energy infrastructure runs on decades-old agreements. Grocery store shelves depend on produce and dairy moving in both directions without friction. You cannot simply slap punishing tariffs across 500 product categories in a relationship like that and expect only one side to feel the pain. It's worth breaking down why energy specifically carries so much weight in this relationship. Canada has long been the single largest foreign supplier of crude oil to the United States, feeding refineries across the Midwest that were built and calibrated around that specific supply. Replacing that volume overnight is not simply a matter of finding a new seller. Refineries are engineered around the particular grade of crude they process, and switching sources at scale takes years of infrastructure investment, not weeks of political posturing. The same logic applies to potash, the mineral fertilizer that much of American corn and soybean farming depends on every planting season, and to uranium, which quietly powers a meaningful share of the country's nuclear electricity generation. None of these are commodities where an alternative supplier can simply be swapped in on short notice, and that reality shaped the entire negotiation far more than either side said out loud. American industries understood this faster than American politics did. Canadian provincial liquor boards had already pulled American spirits off their shelves months before this final deadline in response to earlier rounds of tariffs. The impact on U.S. distillers was brutal, with some reporting export losses to Canada in the range of 70%. Or more. Those distillers did not quietly absorb the hit. They called their senators. They called trade associations. They called the White House directly. When an industry starts lobbying its own government because a trade fight is actively costing it money, that pressure becomes far more persuasive than anything a foreign government could say publicly. The same dynamic played out in the auto sector, arguably the most tightly woven part of this entire relationship. Southern Ontario and the American Midwest share one of the most integrated manufacturing corridors on the planet. A single vehicle can cross the border several times before it's finished, with parts moving back and forth between plants on both sides. Tariff that corridor heavily enough, and you're not simply raising the price of a car, you risk stalling assembly lines outright. Executives from major automakers were not shy about making that case to lawmakers in Washington, and lawmakers listened, because idle factories in their own districts are a far more urgent political problem than a foreign trade dispute happening somewhere else. It's worth remembering that this was not the first time these two countries had clashed over trade, even if the scale this time felt unusually intense. Disputes over softwood lumber have simmered for decades, occasionally boiling over into tariffs and legal battles that dragged on for years. Dairy access has been a recurring irritant in nearly every renegotiation of the broader trade agreement between the two countries. What made 2025 and 2026 different was not the existence of friction, which has always been part of this relationship in some form, but the scale and speed of it. Tariffs measured in the tens of percent, threatened and imposed within weeks rather than negotiated slowly over years, put pressure on supply chains that had never been designed to absorb that kind of shock so quickly. This is the part of Canadian trade strategy that rarely makes it into a headline. It was never really about Canada threatening the United States directly. It was about allowing American industries, the ones actually feeling the cost, to apply pressure on Washington from the inside. Carney did not need to raise his voice in these negotiations. He needed to hold a public position clear enough that American businesses could see exactly where the line was, and loud enough that they'd start pushing their own government to avoid crossing it. That pressure built steadily through the summer of 2026. Canadian officials, led by trade negotiators who stayed in Washington through entire weekends, kept showing up, kept talking, and kept declining to move off Carney's public commitment. And on the other side, the cost of following through on the full tariff threat kept climbing. Analysts pointed out that the actual tariffs, once you accounted for exemptions and existing trade coverage, would have pushed the average tariff rate on Canadian exports only modestly higher, from somewhere around 4.5% to just above 6%. That might sound small in the abstract, but layered on top of an already fragile inflation picture, even a modest increase across hundreds of product categories was not a risk the Federal Reserve or the White House wanted to take lightly, especially with grocery bills, construction, costs, and gas prices, all sensitive to any fresh shock. So when the clock ticked down toward midnight on August the 18th, both sides were staring at the same uncomfortable math. Washington had built a tariff package that excluded its own most vulnerable imports. American industries were already lobbying against the plan from the inside. And Canada had a prime minister who, for over a year, had refused to give any public signal that he might cave under pressure. Trump's post that night mentioned reviving talk of the long-dormant Keystone XL pipeline as part of the emerging deal, along with broader commitments on market access, economic security, and digital trade. Carney's own statement was noticeably more cautious, describing progress rather than a finished agreement, and making clear that Canada intended to keep strengthening its economy regardless of how the final details landed. It also helps to place this specific standoff inside the much larger trade picture Washington was managing at the same time. Throughout 2026, the administration had opened investigations into what it called structural overcapacity across dozens of countries, from major manufacturing economies in Asia to smaller trading partners. Most Americans rarely think about in the context of trade policy. Canada was just one front in a much wider campaign to rewrite the terms of American trade relationships around the world. But unlike many of those other countries, Canada was not simply another name on a long list. It sat right next door, physically wired into American energy grids, manufacturing plants and farmland in ways that made a clean, low-cost separation nearly impossible. That distinction mattered enormously once negotiators actually sat down to hash out details, because leverage that exists on paper looks very different once it collides with a power grid that cannot simply be rerouted overnight, or a harvest season that cannot simply be delayed until a political dispute resolves itself. Before we go any further, here's something a little different. If you've made it this far, you clearly care about understanding the real mechanics behind these headlines. So hit that subscribe button now if you haven't already, not because I'm asking for a favor, but because this channel is built specifically for people who want the full picture instead of a 30-second clip. Let's keep going. What actually makes this moment interesting is not just that a deadline got pushed back, it's what the shape of the emerging deal tells us about how this relationship is being redefined. Reports describing the framework pointed to far more than a simple tariff rollback. They described discussions touching critical minerals, access, alignment on China policy, investment screening, and digital trade cooperation. That is not the language of a country begging for relief. That is the language of two economies negotiating the terms of a much larger, longer-term partnership. Canada's position in these talks was shaped by choices made well before this specific deadline. Earlier in 2026, Ottawa had quietly worked through its own separate trade tensions with Beijing, reaching a preliminary resolution even while the fight with Washington was still ongoing. Carney had been explicit about the logic behind that move. Canada, he said publicly, has other options. That single sentence mattered more than it might seem. A country that genuinely has no alternative partners has very little room to negotiate. A country that has spent real effort diversifying its trade relationships walks into a negotiation with a fundamentally different kind of leverage because the other side knows walking away is not an empty threat. This is also where Carney's specific background becomes relevant again. Someone who has spent years steering monetary policy through genuine financial crises, understands something that career politicians sometimes miss, that panic is expensive and patience is not. Every time Ottawa held its position through another deadline, another round of talks, another set of headlines predicting economic disaster for Canada, the Canadian dollar did not collapse. Bond markets did not panic. That stability, quietly compounding over many months, became its own form of leverage because it signaled to everyone watching, investors, industry leaders, and Washington itself, that Canada's position was not bluster. It was backed by something real. There's a version of this story that plays out in currency markets specifically, and it's worth pausing on. Whenever a country is perceived as cornered in a trade dispute, investors tend to price in that vulnerability quickly, selling off the currency, demanding higher yields on government debt, and generally treating the country as a forced seller in any negotiation. None of that happened to Canada in any dramatic way throughout this standoff. The absence of panic is, in its own quiet way, a signal. It tells professional traders, the people whose job is to price risk accurately and quickly, that the fundamentals underneath Canada's negotiating position were sound. That is a very different story than the one told by countries that have genuinely been cornered in past trade disputes, where currency depreciation and bond market stress became visible within days of an escalating threat. It's worth pausing here to think about why this particular standoff matters beyond just these two countries. There's a broader lesson buried in the story about how smaller economies can hold their ground against much larger trading partners. It is not primarily about military power or the size of a country's GDP. It is about whether that country controls something the larger partner genuinely cannot easily replace. Energy, fertilizer, critical minerals, base load electricity. When a country supplies inputs that another economy's factories, farms, and power grids depend on every single day, that country carries leverage no tariff threat can simply erase. Canada spent this entire standoff quietly reminding Washington of exactly that. Fact, not through aggressive rhetoric, but through the simple, stubborn act of not folding. It's also worth noting how differently this entire episode might have unfolded under a less coordinated Canadian government. Provincial premiers, from Alberta to Ontario to Quebec, did not always agree on strategy or timing throughout this dispute. And there were real public moments of friction between federal and provincial officials about how hard to push and when. What kept the overall position from fracturing was the shared recognition that once you concede an inch on a bad deal, the next round of demands only grows larger. That kind of internal discipline across provinces with genuinely different economic interests, from oil-producing Alberta to manufacturing-heavy Ontario, is not something that happens automatically. It required constant coordination behind the scenes, plenty of disagreement resolved privately, and a shared understanding that presenting a fractured front to Washington would have been far more costly than any short-term political disagreement at home. None of this means the relationship is fully resolved. Even after the pause, Carney's own language made clear that meaningful work remained before any final agreement could be considered complete. The 3-day delay bought time, not certainty. Analysts covering the story were quick to point out that whatever framework eventually emerges will likely shape how the broader continental trade agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico gets renewed and renegotiated in the years ahead. In other words, this was never just about one tariff deadline. It was a preview of how the entire economic relationship between these two countries might be restructured going forward. That renegotiation matters more than most casual observers realize, because the current trade agreement between the three North American countries includes built-in review periods, moments where all sides are supposed to sit down and decide whether the deal still works as written. Everything that happened in these final 90 minutes, the exemptions, the exclusions, the specific language around critical minerals and digital trade, is very likely to become the starting template for those larger conversations. A 3-day pause on a $20 billion tariff threat might sound like a narrow technical story on its own, but the precedent it sets about what each side is willing to fight over and what each side is willing to quietly protect will echo through trade discussions for years after this particular headline fades. There's also something worth noting about how this played out politically inside Canada itself. Carney did not walk into this standoff with unlimited room to maneuver. Provincial governments controlled decisions like removing American alcohol from store shelves, and he could encourage that kind of action without being able to simply order it. Trade officials who stayed in Washington through entire weekends answered to a domestic political reality where any visible concession seen as a betrayal of his own public promise would have been politically costly. That constraint, strangely enough, worked in Canada's favor. When a negotiator genuinely cannot say yes to a bad offer without facing serious consequences back home, the other side eventually has to offer something better. It's a basic principle of negotiation, but it's rarely executed with this much discipline over such a long stretch of time. It is worth remembering, too, that ordinary people on both sides of the border were never abstract bystanders in this story. A dairy farmer in Wisconsin and a dairy farmer in Quebec were both watching the same deadline with very different fears. An auto worker in Windsor and an auto worker in Detroit were both wondering whether their shift schedule would still make sense a week later. None of the finance language, the exemption lists, the percentage points actually captures what this standoff meant at ground level, where a tariff is not a policy abstraction, but a very real threat to a paycheck, a small business, or a family farm that has operated across that border for generations. Whatever verdict history eventually delivers on who won this particular round, it is worth remembering that the people most affected by the outcome rarely get a seat anywhere near the negotiating table. Meanwhile, on the American side, the political pressure ran in almost the opposite direction. Voters do not usually experience a trade dispute through economic reports or diplomatic statements. They experience it through the price of groceries, the cost of a new car, or a delayed home renovation because lumber suddenly costs more. Advisors inside the administration understood that consumer-level pain translates into political pain far faster than any trade statistic ever could. Layer a tariff shock on top of an economy already managing inflation concerns, and you have a recipe for exactly the kind of backlash no White House wants heading into future election cycles. That reality, more than any single phone call, is likely what tipped the final decision toward a pause rather than a full escalation. It's tempting, watching a moment like this unfold, to declare a clean winner and a clean loser, the way a sports broadcast might sum up a final score. But trade relationships this deeply integrated rarely work that way. Both economies absorbed real costs, just getting to this point. Uncertainty that delayed investment decisions, contracts that got rewritten out of caution, industries on both sides of the border that spent months bracing for a worst-case scenario that, in the end, did not fully materialize. A pause is not the same as resolution. It is closer to both sides agreeing, however reluctantly, that the cost of finding out who would blink first for real was simply too high for either economy to absorb comfortably. So where does this actually leave both countries as the days following that pause unfold? The delay itself was only ever meant to last a few days, buying time for negotiators to finalize documents rather than resolving every outstanding disagreement. Whether the framework holds, whether it expands into something closer to the broader strategic partnership hinted at in early reporting, or whether talks stall again once the immediate deadline pressure lifts, remains to be seen. What is already clear is that this was not a case of one side simply overpowering the other. It was closer to two sides finally being forced to acknowledge just how tightly bound their economies actually are, and how expensive it would be for either one to pretend otherwise. There's a broader financial lesson sitting underneath all of this that extends well past Canada and the United States specifically. Trade power in the modern world is not always about the size of an economy. It is about structural indispensability, about whether you supply something the other side genuinely cannot do without on short notice. Canada's energy exports, its mineral reserves, its agricultural inputs, and its electricity. Ties to American regions gave it a form of leverage that no amount of political rhetoric from Washington could simply talk away. And Carney's consistent, calm refusal to accept a deal that ignored that leverage turned 3 repeated words into one of the more consequential negotiating positions in recent North American economic history. Compare Canada's approach to how some other countries handled similar pressure from Washington during this same period. Several major trading partners reached agreements with the United States relatively quickly, often accepting terms that drew criticism back home for conceding too much too fast. The pressure to simply make a deal, any deal, and move on to calmer headlines is real, especially for governments facing their own domestic political clocks. Canada took a different, slower, more expensive seeming path, one that invited criticism at multiple points along the way for not settling sooner. Whether that patience ultimately proves to have been the right strategic call will likely be debated by trade economists for years. But what is already clear is that it produced a different kind of outcome than the quick settlements other countries accepted, one built around explicit exemptions for the sectors Canada could least afford to lose, rather than a broad concession made simply to end the uncertainty. It's also worth asking what this entire episode reveals about negotiating with an administration known for aggressive opening positions and rapid escalation. The instinct for many governments faced with that kind of pressure is to settle early, to avoid the risk of an even larger threat materializing down the road. Canada's experience suggests a different lesson, that holding a clear, publicly stated position, even under sustained pressure and repeated deadlines, can shift the underlying dynamic over time, especially when that position is backed by resources the other side cannot easily replace. That is not a universal formula every country can apply, since not every economy holds the kind of structural leverage Canada does. But for the countries that do have real leverage buried in their resource base, this standoff offers a genuinely useful case study in what patient, resource-backed negotiation can accomplish, even against a much larger and more aggressive trading partner. If you've stuck with this video all the way to this point, you already understand something about how trade actually works that most casual headlines never bother to explain. So here's my last ask. Hit subscribe if you haven't yet, because this channel is going to keep tracking exactly how this framework develops in the weeks ahead, and drop a comment letting me know whether you think Canada came out of this standoff stronger, or whether you think the real test is still ahead once the cameras move on to the next headline. What actually stopped the tariff wall was not a single dramatic gesture or a last-minute concession pulled out of thin air. It was months of quiet, consistent positioning, backed by resources neither side could pretend to live without. 3 words, repeated patiently across a year of pressure, turned out to carry more weight than 50% on a tariff sheet. Think about what that actually means for how power works between countries that are supposed to be wildly mismatched in size. On paper, this was never supposed to be a fair fight. One economy dwarfs the other many times over, commands a larger military, a larger population, and a far louder megaphone on the world stage. And yet, when the clock actually ran down to its final minutes, it was the smaller economy that held its line, and the larger one that adjusted course. That is not the story most people expect when they hear about a trade standoff between these two countries. And that gap between expectation and reality is exactly why this moment deserves more attention than a single news cycle ever gave it. There's also a quieter, more human note worth sitting with here. Behind every exemption, every percentage point, every carefully worded statement from Ottawa or Washington, there were real businesses recalculating their futures in real time, real workers wondering if their jobs were about to become collateral damage in a dispute they had no part in creating. The 3-day pause did not erase that anxiety instantly, and it will not be forgotten quickly by the industries that spent months bracing for the worst. But it did buy something valuable, a little more time for cooler heads, for actual negotiators, instead of deadlines, to shape what comes next, and a little more evidence that patient, resource-backed diplomacy can still outlast a countdown clock. And whatever comes next in this relationship, one thing already feels certain. The next time a government finds itself staring down a much larger trading partner across a negotiating table, this moment will likely be studied closely, not as a story about one country beating another, but as a reminder that leverage built on real, physical, irreplaceable resources tends to outlast leverage built on rhetoric alone. That lesson, quietly proven with 90 minutes to spare before a $20 billion deadline, is unlikely to be forgotten by either side of this border anytime soon.